Today we will be looking at bankruptcy filing trends by chapter in the state of Mississippi. To do this, we have about a dozen charts showing bankruptcy activity in the state going back to 1990. All of this data on filings comes from the Administrative Office of the United States Courts. The first chart shows total filings by year from 1990 through 2015. Now, during this period, there have been nearly 400,000 cases filed in the state, and the state's population is only about 3 million right now, so there's quite a lot of bankruptcy activity there. In the early 1990s, you can see that filings were running around 10,000, 12,000 per year. This jumped up to, say, 17,000 to 18,000 filings per year by the late 1990s. In the early 2000s, filings were over 20,000 per year. They jumped up a little bit in 2005. That was a year of bankruptcy reform, but this spike was much less than most other states had. Dropped down to under 9,000 in 2006. Went back up through 2009 as the recession was coming on, and then have fallen back to about 11,000 in 2015. It's only about a 25% decline during those 5 years where nationwide filings were down, or 6 years, nationwide filings were down nearly half during that period. And right now filings are about where they were back in the early 1990s. Looking at filings relative to population, Mississippi's got a very high rate. They're 28% above the national average. And you can see that most of the states with high filing rates relative to population are in the southeast. Looking year by year, there's been some difference over time. So the gap between Mississippi and the national average was higher, say, from 1996 to about 2004, is around 40% above the average. And since, say, 2008 to 2015, they've been about 13% above average. Looking at Chapter 7 filings by year, 1990 and 1995, they were around 7,000 per year, about 11,000 by the late 1990s, got up to 15,000 just before reform. Little spike, huge drop off, and then they nearly doubled by 2009. But you can see that even here they were just a little more than half of what they had been prior to bankruptcy reform, and then have fallen down about 34% through 2015. And you can see that they are, now well below where they were back 25 years ago. Chapter 11 filings in the state, there's a big drop-off during the early 1990s, and this is consistent with most other parts of the country. Most years since, say, the mid-1990s, there have been about 50 to 75 cases filed per year. A little bit higher during and after recessions. And it looks like in 2016, the state is on pace for about 55 or 60 cases per year. Chapter 13 filings in the state, and there tends to be less variation on this than other chapters, but around 4,000 or 5,000 early 90s. By the late 90s and early 2000s, it was around 7,000 to 8,000 per year. Dropped off a little bit after reform, and then have been around 6,000 per year since about 2007. And you can see that Chapter 13 filings are well above where they were back in the 1990s, and that contrasts with the 7s and the 11s, which are both down. Now, looking at the percent of cases that are filed as Chapter 13, the national average has followed this 30% line pretty closely over the years, with some disruption around bankruptcy reform. In Mississippi, throughout the 90s, they're right around 40%. And then after the disruption of bankruptcy reform, have been 40 to 50% or so. Like most of the Southeast, Chapter 13s are much more frequent in Mississippi. Looking at the unemployment rate in Mississippi, and this is kind of as a proxy for how the economy is going. It's consistently been 1 or 2% above the national average, and and stays there now. So right now, Mississippi is at about 6% versus about 5% nationwide. But throughout, since 2006, they've been above the average every quarter. Now, filings peaked nationwide in September 2010, and since then they're down 49% nationwide. In Mississippi, the decline is only 24%, and that is the lowest among the 50 states. Puerto Rico has only had a 10% decline, but among the 50 states, Mississippi's had the smallest decline. In the Northern District, filings are down 31%, and the Southern District are down 18%. Looking quarter by quarter, what the changes, and most quarters, the declines in Mississippi were, in the 5, maybe 10% range. There's one anomaly in 2013 where it looked like filings spiked up and then dropped way down a year later. I think this, when I see a pattern like this, it's almost always because several hundred old cases were reopened, and they skewed the filings one quarter, and then it may look like a bigger drop off a year later. Looking at most recent trends, we had 3 quarters were from the last quarter of 2015, the first 2 quarters of 2016, filings have actually gone up just a slight bit. And so in the first 6 months of this year, filings were up a little under 2% in Mississippi. You can see other states are starting to show increases now. These are the red-colored states. And there aren't that many states that are having big declines now of over 10%, a few out west and a few scattered throughout the country. In the third quarter, it looks like filings were up about 7% in Mississippi, so I expect to see more increases. I think what we'll see is around 12 to 5,000 cases filed per year in the state in the next couple of years. But I don't foresee any return to the over 20,000 cases per year that the state received, say, from 2001 to 2005, unless there is some major legislative change or another recession. Well, that concludes this look at bankruptcy filings in Mississippi. For more statistical information and other information on bankruptcy, be sure to visit the newsroom section of the ABI website at www.abi.org.